That's right. Hello readers and writers, I'm MJ, and today we're going to be talking about my June wrap-up. So for June, I read a total of 11 books, which is fairly average for myself. Not high, not exceedingly low. However, the books that I did read, I tend to read 300 or higher pages, but in June, a lot of the books that I read ended up being shorter. I'm not entirely sure why, it just ended up working out that way. I do think it's partly because I did read more nonfiction, and the nonfiction books I read were shorter. I'm very happy that 22% of the books I read in June were nonfiction. I have been slacking on this for myself and have been trying to read more nonfiction because I really enjoy nonfiction, and I tend to not read it because it tends to lower the amount of books I read in a month, and that's just a really dumb reason not to read it. Of the books I read this month, 45% of them were print, 45% were audiobook, and only 9% were digital, which is kind of surprising. I didn't read as many ARCs, I guess, in June. There were no DNFs in June, and my lowest star rating was a 3-star rating, which was actually one of those nonfiction books. So let's go into what I actually read this month. So I present what I read in order of what I read it, just because that's easier for me. And the first book I picked up is How the King of Elfheim Learns to Hate Stories. And I'm not entirely sure why I picked this up exactly in the beginning of June. It was just like one of those things that was on my shelf. And the audiobook was available, and I ended up picking it up and finally getting it off my physical TBR. So I did read this via audiobook, but then kind of like looked at the pictures and stuff because there's beautiful illustrations in this. And I am excited that I read it. It was fun. I enjoyed it. It wasn't anything like super spectacular, but it was a nice little companion read to the trilogy. The next, the next thing I read was By Your Side, and this was an ARC read for an author that I follow on Instagram. It is a long short story, so I think it was about 100 pages. No, it's 65 pages. And this, I signed up to be an ARC reader because it featured a queer platonic relationship. I enjoyed this book, or the story. I ended up rating it 4.75 stars. I like the representation of a queer platonic relationship, and I like that concept of someone going into one even though they may not be a-spec, and found that intriguing. It was a short story, so it could have potentially have been more developed. It's a little probably new adult for my typical taste, but you don't really find representation for 40-year-olds, unfortunately, which is why I try and write it. So, enjoyable read. Definitely would recommend that you check it out. Then I picked up Never Ever Getting Back Together, and this is a Rainbow Crate pick that featured a reality television show about everyone who had dated this prince person coming back together to like re-date him to see who's going to like win his favor, but like everyone hates him and still goes back together, and then it ends up turning sapphic because of bi representation. And I picked it up because I had it from Rainbow Crates, but it's again very new adult. It was fine. I'm sure a lot of people really enjoy it. There's nothing like bad about it. I ended up rating it 4 stars, but it really wasn't really my thing. There wasn't anything like extra that pulled me in personally, which sometimes there is, and that's why I will still read them. But I'm not sure this is what I'm going to keep on my shelf. But that's not to say it's not a good book, and I'm sure a lot of other people will appreciate it more than I do. It just wasn't exactly for me, but it was still good. And then I read an indie book, Shadow of the Wicked, and this is one of those, it's a novella, or a long short story. It's 108 pages, that is set in one of those like anthology worlds where like authors write pieces of the same world, but that they don't necessarily, like, you don't have to read like the whole world in order to understand what's going on. And I enjoyed this. I read it 4 stars, but I personally wish it would have been a little bit more diverse. It follows 2 twin brothers, one who's a magic user and one who like is out to get magic users. I didn't really like the female representation in it. I think it was surface level, and when you really like looked at it, it became concerning. And I don't think it was in any way, shape, or form meant that way, or that the author like is problematic. Like, I don't mean it that way. I mean that it just, the female's representation could have been better developed, so that it then didn't end up becoming the representation that it did. And since they were the only 2 female characters in there, that they both kind of had the same plot line, is that's when it became something of an issue, even though I don't think it was intended that way. And I would absolutely 100% pick up something else from this author, specifically if it's something a little bit more diverse, and I actually am really excited to see what he's writing next. That being said, like, I would recommend this story to certain people. It's just very alpha male fantasy, and like, as a reader, I don't follow either spectrum very well. It seems like fantasy is either like alpha male fantasy or it's like romantasy, and I don't personally enjoy either of them. Again, that goes back to the whole being non-binary, agender. I think is I don't really relate to anything that's too like super male or anything. Now, romantasy is not gender based, but I'm also like aro ace, and so I don't really connect with that aspect of fantasy author, but it does tend to be written more towards female readership, and I prefer fantasy that like falls outside those 2 mainstreams, and this is just one that falls more towards the alpha male fantasy, which has huge readership and is a staple of the basis of what fantasy was built on. And so if you enjoy that, then I 100% recommend that you would pick up the story. There's nothing problematic about the story. I just think the representation should have been more diverse and more thought out. And again, will 100% pick up and try this author again when he publishes something else. The writing was actually spectacular, and I think that I'm very excited to see what else that he ends up coming out with. Now, the next book I picked up is This Book is Gay, and I think this book has been revised, and I got the non-revised version, but I could be wrong about that. I also think this author ended up coming out as trans, but again, I could be wrong about that. It's because I tried to Google it, and I got, like, mixed. And so I'm very conflicted about this book. It is written very binary. And I mean that as either you're one thing or another. It comes straight out and says that everyone has sexual attraction, even though it does have like one paragraph on being asexual. It is written for males and uses the binary male-female. Often like he or she often, which is not very inclusive in the whole LGBTQ spectrum. And so I personally felt very excluded from reading this book. And so I did not enjoy it. I would not recommend it to anyone who is non-binary, anyone who is aspec, or anyone who falls outside of any of the binaries, sexuality or gender-wise. That being said, I do think this book has a place and can be very important and life-changing in individuals' lives. So I do think if this book is revised that it would be so much better, but I don't think this book is like bad. I think that some people, especially like, you know, teenagers who specifically are male and gay, can probably find so much in this to relate to, and it could be life-changing for them. And so in that respect, this is really good, and it's who it's written for, and it's a book that they would need. So just because it didn't work for me doesn't mean it can't be life-changing for somebody else and much needed for a different population. So I do think this is not a broad LGBTQIA book. I do think it's written for a subset of the LGBTQ population, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I do hope that in the revision of this, that it does use more inclusive language, because that is problematic for LGBTQ people overall, and because one of the target of the books is for people that just want to know more about being the LGBTQIA community, and that individuals who are not gay may read this and then overgeneralize trans issues and aspec issues, and that can end up being problematic. So I was disappointed in this book, but I understand its place. Alright, the next book I finally picked up is Sea of Tranquility. And after I read this, someone connected it to The Glass Houses, which I have not read, of Emily St. John Mandel. So I do want to go read that to see if the books actually are connected to each other. I did end up reading this via audiobook. I probably at some point will go back and read it via like the paper and annotate it. It's beautifully written. I love the time travel aspect of it. I thought how it was developed was intriguing. It does contain a pandemic, so that may be concerning to certain individuals. It also includes life living on Mars, or the moon, although there might be Mars on here too, but specifically it talks about moon colonies and has a lot of future sci-fi representation, which was really cool, and just how it was woven in. And then it talks about the life of a writer, and just also like a character who like can't find their way, kind of coming up with their purpose in life and then making a difference. I kind of like that story thread, but beautifully written. I definitely am a huge fan of her works, and I do need to pick up Glass Houses and read that as well. And I don't know if she has anything else. I've only read Station 11 and this one to date, and I'm not sure if she has any other novels, but highly recommend her. Highly recommend her work. And really enjoyed it. Ended up rating it 4 stars. Alright, the next book I picked up is The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. And I picked this up because it was supposed to have, or I had heard it had, a romantic representation, and so it's got bumped up on my priority list. And C.L. Polk wrote the Witchstorm trilogy, which is super queer, and so I expected this to be a queer novel. And it's June, so it seemed like a great time to like pick this up. I thought maybe it would end up working for my Queer Lit Readathon bingo someplace. And then it turns out this book is not queer at all. So 100% with complete certainty, the main character is not a romantic. 100% certain. So for all the talk about this being a romantic representation, there's no way people were talking about the main character. No chance. Potentially, people were talking about a side character, but I still would argue that that is not a romantic representation. If it is a romantic representation, then it's not very clearly defined a romantic representation, and therefore I don't think it's necessarily valid unless the author came out at some point and specifically said it's a romantic representation. But even then, it's a romantic representation of a side character. But I think with this book, the one thing I would take away is being a romantic is different than just choosing to not marry. It is different than choosing to not marry because of societal expectations put on women. And this book talks a lot about being a woman in a repressive society. And I think this is a very, very valid topic. I think this book handles it extremely well. It talks about female empowerment. It talks about taking power back for women, and it talks about how women are doing this in a like undercurrent of society, and how this is like, how minority groups find ways to still communicate through the oppressiveness of the majority. And I think these are extremely valid conversations, and I think this novel is extremely valuable for what it talks about. But because a woman chooses not to marry because they want to do something else, because they have professional ambitions, does not make them a romantic. A romantic is completely different than female empowerment or just personal empowerment. Being a romantic, I don't have it's not a choice. It is part of who I am, just as much as being like I am incapable of having romantic feelings for somebody. It cannot happen. I have tried, I have attempted, I have done everything in my power to make myself mold into this expectation of society, and I cannot. It is not part of who I am. And that is very different than if I were to just say, I don't want to be married. I don't want a relationship. And to me, this representation is this side character choosing to put their profession and their ambition above marriage, and that marriage would then constrain that ambition and that professional goal that she has. And that is extremely valid, but that is not a romanticism. And so I want to say, I enjoyed this book. I tabbed the heck out of it. It was great for what it is. But I would completely hands down argue that this is not a romanticism. There is perhaps 2 comments in this entire book that I think could potentially be misconstrued as aromanticism, and then I would again argue that this is not a romantic representation, that this is a side character who has chose to put her professional ambitions above marriage, because marriage would constrain who she is, because she is these professional ambitions. Very valid. 100%. Great message. Not a romanticism. Even if the attempt was to be a romantic representation, it got 2 lines out of the whole book that maybe could have gone that way. And so I don't think this should be one of the main books on a romantic list. It's just not. I mean, I don't know. It's just frustrating that this is the rep that's out there, and that this is what like makes all the lists. But this is not. Like, this is just misconstruing what aromanticism is. So good book. Really enjoyed it. Knock it off all your aromantic lists now, please. Every time I see it on a list, I am going to be compelled to be like, well, okay, I read that, and are you sure you really think it should be on there? Because we could have a discussion about why I don't think it should be. The next book I read was another arc by an indie author. It's The Artifice of Eternity. It just released the beginning of July. It is a science fiction novel, multi-generational, about a group of humans going to colonize another planet. I really, really enjoyed this book. It's one of those books that when I finished, my mind kept working to try and come up with like other plots and connectedness, and I would love to read a whole bunch of short stories just like further expanding on different aspects of the worlds, because I have like theories. So if anyone else has reads this book and picks it up, feel free to come in my DMs to talk about it, because I have ideas about potential it deals in part with the ability interactions through time, and which leads to all sorts of ideas and concepts. There is one caveat I have to this book. There's a situation that happens fairly early on in the novel that I don't feel was explained through well enough. I also think it could be integrated in more so, but it left me confused, and my autistic brain really caught on to this one aspect that really didn't end up being central to the novel, but I kept on to that thread throughout the whole thing, trying to wait for it to become more important, and then it never did. And it kind of got resolved, but not in a way that satisfied myself. But again, the more I started reading, the more we started going through, the more I started realizing that this point wasn't as central as I had originally thought it was. And so even by the time I got to the end, I started to kind of let this go. But it was such an integral part to my reading experience that it was a letdown, that it didn't become more major of a plot point. But I really enjoyed the characters of this. The world building was excellent. The description between Earth and this planet, and how they were the same and the difference, I really enjoyed that. It was a lot of fun to read, and it's a world I would absolutely love to revisit. So if you like science fiction, and specifically are looking for science fiction by indie authors, because it's so hard to find good science fiction by indie authors, this is definitely one I would absolutely highly recommend. Rated at 5 stars. So that may leave it as my favorite book of the month, I think. Let's finish. Maybe we'll see. Alright, the next book I read is another indie book called The Clan of Miss, and this is a book that I picked up because I followed the person on Instagram. I don't normally like going to Romantasy, and so I was really hesitant picking it up, but I also really wanted to support the author. But I was really happy. Yes, it is absolutely a Romantasy. There is some spice in it. I would not say it's very spicy book. There was only a couple scenes that I kind of skipped over because I don't like reading that. And so for some of y'all it may not have enough spice, but it definitely had open door spice in it. What I really enjoyed about it is that even though it's a romantasy, I don't mean to like disqualify that, but some romantasies can be so romance heavy that they renege on the fantasy aspect of it, and The Clown of Mist did not do that. The Clown of Mist had a very, very strong fantasy plot, great world building, great characterizations, and then there was also romance built into that plot and with some spice. And so as a non-romance reader, I appreciated the world building and the rules of magic and such that were in this world. And so I think it's great when a novel can handle both aspects of it, of like a strong fantasy world as well as the romantic aspect of it. And so I ended up rating it 4 stars, which for me on a romantasy is like super high. So I also enjoyed the writing for the most part. There was a few aspects of, there was a few too many fragmented sentences for my taste, and then there were some times where the writing, like they used the same word in one sentence and then used it again in like the next sentence, and so those aspects stood out and I did not like, but the overall writing of it I really enjoyed, the flow of it, and such. Like, it was really well done. So it was a fast and good read. The next book I picked up via audiobook, my library ended up getting in, so I'm super excited about it. And I ended up buying quite a bit of copies, which I'm very happy about. And that is Page Boy by Elliot Page. And this is a memoir about his life. And it talked about a lot of aspects of his life, from his childhood becoming an actor, which was kind of fascinating, because I didn't know about him as an actor until he started working in the Umbrella Academy, and I know that Juno was a huge hit of his, and I think he'd like heard about the movie, but I've never watched it, and I don't know if I would want to go back and watch it, because I think it would be uncomfortable watching him play a pregnant teenage girl. Like, I don't know, it would be like too much dissociation for me to see. So I don't know if I don't know if it's a movie really meant for me. Anyways, but I enjoyed seeing him as a in the Umbrella Academy, and then of course when he came out as trans, it was a huge deal, and it was kind of the timing was when I was coming out as well, and so seeing another adult, he's younger than me, but not by too much. He came out in like his mid-30s, I think, and I came out in my 40s, so watching him transition in the public spotlight was really impactful for me as a non-binary adult going through similar situations, not in the public spotlight. And so it was personally validating. So even though he has no idea I exist, he was extremely helpful to me during my transition period, if that makes sense. And so I really appreciate this memoir because it's so easy to think we know celebrities, and yet we know nothing. Even now, after reading the memoir, we still know nothing. But it still was, it was, like, I appreciate the fact that he was willing to share this much about himself, and it was just a great story. I mean, like, it wasn't a great story the things that have happened to him in his life, but it was a great story in how it was told. He's definitely a storyteller, and in the way he communicated about his life and the level that he was willing to share, and with how much I ended up relating to so much of it. So I really, really appreciate that. I definitely, of course, would recommend this to everyone. I especially would recommend this to I would recommend this to everyone. But cis individuals, I think this would be very helpful for y'all to go read, because he doesn't shy away from how much this has impacted his whole life. Like, people don't just randomly decide one day that they're going to be trans. It's something that they have had as part of their life and then had to repress at some points, and then it's like the repression caused problems, and then like this is a struggle that I intimately related to, because it's not just at 40 I decided to become non-binary. This has been, it was at 40 I decided I was going to free myself from trying to define myself by how society wanted me to define myself, and instead come out of by who I really am. And that's kind of the story that Elliot has told, among a bunch of other stuff about Hollywood, about acting, and at the same time I'm also reading Will Wheaton's revised autobiography, and just like, it's interesting the difference between the two of them as both child actors, both with not great families, and how they relate to acting is very different. And so that contrast was very interesting. So the last book I read in June, The Rules and Regulations for Myths and Magic, and this is, I guess it's technically an indie book by F.T. Lukens. It's one that put out by Rainbow Crate, but this is a fairly well-known author, so I have a hard time representing an author that's also mainstream as an indie author. I don't know, maybe their other books are indie also, but I don't think so. I think they've been picked up by traditional publishers. But technically, since this came out as a special edition at Rainbow Crate, it is at least an indie release. It was fine. It was very, I don't know, it was a fine read. I didn't like it at first. I didn't like the writing style at first at all. I thought they were trying to do something a bit too cutesy, and I wish they would have gone back and rewritten it. I'm not gonna lie. The last part of it, though, that stopped, and once that stopped, I started enjoying it more. The world is very interesting. I think the concept of it is very interesting, but I'm not entirely sure how much I really related to it. It does have a bi representation, so the main character is a teenage boy who's coming to terms with the fact that he is bi, and he has a crush on a boy, and I think that's very, very important representation to have in books. And I know that the author writes other male-male romance for YA, and I think they are non-binary, but I am not certain. It was an interesting world. It was a good read. Like, I don't regret reading it. I wish the first part of the book was as good as the last part of the book, but I also wish I could find queer books that I related to more, honestly. I think that's really what it is. So that is my June wrap up. Overall, it was not bad, not amazing. If y'all have adult-centric, specifically not romance, LGBTQIA books, please leave them in the comments, because I would love to pick more of those up. And otherwise, I hope you had an excellent Pride Month. Remember to keep reading queer all year long, but not only that, keep reading diverse books all year long, because it's important. And as always, keep writing, keep reading, and until next time.